So David, thank you for being here. I look forward to hearing your wisdom once again. Over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome to everybody. Really good to be together. And what I'm finding, and maybe you too, is that while we don't have the pleasure of being in each other's physical company, and there are things we miss about that, there are still opportunities in being online that, in my view, aren't better or worse than being together in person. They're just different. It's a different way of being together and sharing something. And it's rather amazing what can happen between us. So just invite you all not to underestimate what we might share here together. I'd like to start by simply acknowledging these unique, extraordinary times that we're in during this global pandemic. We're sharing in an experience with people around the world, a little different wherever we are, but many similarities as well. And I do see this as a time for us to come together, to pull together as human beings around the world, as the human race. I think a good place to start here together is to acknowledge all the heroes of this pandemic. So many millions and even billions of people around the world doing their part. And we are witness to something of a birth in these extraordinary times of people coming forth and being of service, each in their own unique way. I'd like to name some people who are heroes to me during this time, knowing that these are just a few, very few people, each of whom probably represent millions more. So I invite you to tune into your awareness of all those who are being of service in whatever way they are, as I mentioned these. Maybe you heard about someone who's simply known as Nurse Jenny from New Zealand, and Louis Pitarma. These are two nurses who were at Boris Johnson's side when things could have gone either way for him. To them, they were just doing their duty. They're being of service to him like they would for anyone. And certainly the two of them are simply representative of probably millions more in the healthcare field. So in all our respective countries, we honor those in that position. In New York, here in America, there was recently a Dr. Lorna M. Breen. She was taking care of coronavirus patients. She saved lives, and she saw many, many die. She herself contracted the coronavirus and then recovered from it and went back to be of service, and only several days ago took her own life. She was just so disturbed by what she saw and what she experienced and was overcome by it. And so I think of all those heroes who are enduring all that they are on the front lines of taking care of the rest of us. I think of all the governmental leaders. Someone who stands out in my mind as having stepped up to the occasion and taken just very diligent care of the people of his state is Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York. He has really rallied the people of New York to deal with what they're dealing with. I think of all the grocery store clerks. I know I'm often greeted with a smile, as perhaps you are too. Smile and a kind word, and even a question as to how I'm doing. So here's to all the grocery store clerks, wherever they may be around the world. Heard that in Spain there was an anonymous doctor who wrote to the Spanish people when he became aware that there are patients in isolation who were fighting for their lives, but unable to be visited by any of their family members, and only had healthcare workers checking in on them maybe several times a day, but other than that, were alone. And so he invited the Spanish people to write to people who were alone, isolated in hospitals. And the Spanish people rallied for their fellow citizens. And there were 30,000 letters written in just 1 week. There are Sikh volunteers in Melbourne offering free home meal delivery service to people self-isolating. And then in Poland, it made me laugh that there are Polish seamstresses that used to be sewing lingerie, but who are now sewing masks, face masks, to keep people safe. So I know you join me in witnessing the extraordinary way that people are coming forth in these times. Then we think of all the people at home who are self-isolating. It's called here, stay at home. I'm here in Colorado at Sunrise Ranch, and our governor called for us to stay at home. And then he lightened some of the restrictions, and it's now called safe at home or safer at home. So good to be with you and to consider this topic that is our topic for today. I want to share a presentation. So we're speaking about the role of consciousness in birthing a new world. So we're speaking about a new world being born, and being born through consciousness as a conscious act. As a conscious act. We tend to think of ourselves as human beings as being unique in having consciousness. So be that as it may, let's simply acknowledge that all of the great changes that have happened in human culture have happened through consciousness. We can think of everything going back to the invention of the wheel, to monotheism, this great advent of spirituality, a new way of understanding spirituality. We could think of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and other kinds of great cultural shifts that have occurred. In South Africa, the liberation of the South African people from the limiting reality of apartheid. And all those cultural shifts began with a change in consciousness. We can think of the industrial age and then the information age today. Something shifted in the way people were thinking of things. And because of those shifts in consciousness, there were cultural shifts, societal shifts, and all of those shifts came into the physical world that began to manifest in the physical world. So it is also interesting to note that those shifts in consciousness usually happened in a very small group of people, maybe even with one or two people. I think of South Africa and the privilege and the honor that I've had of visiting your country there and getting somewhat familiar with the great shifts that are happening in your country and have happened. And I, of course, I think of one man, Nelson Mandela. How pivotal, how crucial was he to the culture of South Africa and its emergence? How critical were the shifts in his consciousness to the shift in the culture? What I know about his life is that he walked into prison an angry man, you might say for a reason, but still an angry man. And then he walked out years later, a liberated man, a loving man. And those shifts in his own awareness, those shifts in his own consciousness inspired your nation, inspired the world. Shifts in consciousness matter, and the shifts in you that we undergo individually, the shifts that you have, that you undertake and experience, and the shifts that I have matter. And then we together, when some grouping of people experience a shift in consciousness, that can change culture around the world. So we're in that process, and I'd like to explore that with you, and I'd like to really expand the notion of consciousness. We look out at the natural world, we look out at our solar system, our galaxy, and even the universe. We tend to think of the creation all around us as simply energy and matter, as substance and energy, without giving credence to the possibility of consciousness, to the possibility that all that we know of in an external sense is an expression of something inside. It's the expression certainly of a creative power, but even the expression of being itself. We ourselves are a being. The very notion of Gaia says that we understand that this planet is not just things, some, as we think of, inanimate and some animate. No, this planet is a living being that's giving expression to itself in all the ways that it does. And in fact, we are in a living universe, not living necessarily in this biological sense, but it's a being universe. In this universe in which we live, there are galaxies that are being born, suns that are being born, galaxies and suns emerge and have a lifetime and then also merge and pass away. I have several photos of galaxies for us to enjoy, taken from the Hubble telescope. I hope as you look at these photos, you see the wonder of creation in them, and entertain the possibility that there's consciousness, that there's expression and manifestation happening throughout the universe. What appears to be a bright star is actually a supernova there, which is the end of a lifetime of a star or a sun. I want to touch on the work of Rupert Sheldrake. For some reason we can't see his name here. He's a biologist and author. And he's written extensively about morphic fields. And I'd like to share some of his work and some of the work that's been done. Oh, there's his name. Some of the work that's been done around morphic fields. Rupert Sheldrake has posed the idea that the universe operates from a memory and a habit. That while we've tended to think of the universe as operating from law, that in fact it has consciousness, and you might even say a subconscious memory. So it has memory and habit. It has a way of doing things that evolves over time. And if we think of habit and memory, we also think of something else, which is intelligence. There's an unfolding intelligence that's operating through universal mind that is guiding the evolution of the universe. So he asked, how are these fields inherited? So how do we inherit those habits, those memories, and that intelligence from out of the past that's evolving? And he proposes that they are transmitted from past members of the species through a kind of non-local resonance called morphic resonance. And the fields organizing the activity of the nervous system, our own nervous system, or the nervous system of other species, are likewise inherited through morphic resonance, conveying a collective, instinctive memory. Each individual both draws upon and then contributes to the collective memory of the species. And that's so vital. That has to do with our own thought, our own emerging habits, our own emerging awareness that's moving into the morphic field of our species. So that's all from Rupert Sheldrake. So the idea is that everything has a morphic field and is part of other morphic fields. In other words, there's a holonic structure of fields within fields, all contributing to the universal morphic field. And those morphic fields organize creation at every level, from the atoms to molecules, organelles, cells, tissues, organs, organisms, societies, ecosystems, planetary systems, solar systems, and galaxies. And as humans, we have morphogenetic or form-creating fields for the personal, social, and the cultural morphic fields in which we participate. Our body parts, our emotions, thoughts, behaviors, spirituality, family systems, and relationships all have morphic fields that are associated with them. They underlie our mental activity and our perceptions. And I'd like to expand that to say that there's this interactive relationship between the morphic field and our own thoughts, but then also our thoughts and the morphic field. So how we think, our new awareness, the new things that we're awakening to, are part of the morphic field and are changing the morphic field. And that in fact, that is how evolution happens. It happens through thought. For us as human beings, it happens through our thought, but through the other patterns of evolution in the universe, it's happening through a process that is, we might call universal thought. The universe is constantly reimagining itself and moving itself forward. And we get to be a part of that. Our minds are plugged into, or in fact, instruments of that universal thought that is moving creation forward. So I know I'm stretching our usual awareness of how all this works. So I hope you're enjoying letting go of the personal ways in which we tend to think, the personally bound ways in which we tend to think, opening up to allowing our thoughts to think the thoughts of the reimagining of our own lives, the reimagining of human culture, the reimagining of humankind, and the rebirth of humankind. And while that might seem like a stretch, seem even fantastic, what I'm suggesting to you is that that's what's been happening all along. That's been constantly happening for us as human beings, for sure, over decades, centuries, and millennia. But that is also what's happening in the universal whole. There's an amazing paper, which you could look up and find if you care to, by these two Indian scientists. It's entitled The Role of the Evolutionary Urge in Epigenetics and Gene Culture Coevolution, a meta-evolution perspective. And if you want your mind bent a little bit, go ahead and read this article. They're really doing a fantastic job of looking at the science and putting together scientific findings to suggest the power of consciousness to affect culture and our evolution as a species. I've selected a few brief things out of the article to share with you. They talk about urge, and they talk about the urge in us as human beings, the urge in biological species, and then the urge in creation itself out beyond the biology that we share with species around the planet. So they say this: thus, the fundamental urges for survival, freedom, joy, etc., can be seen to have led to evolution of culture, which exerts a corresponding selective pressure, resulting in short-term adaptations. We could think of that in so many ways. We could think of South Africa, which of course those of you who live there are so much more familiar with than me. I could think of my own nation and the urge for survival and freedom and joy, as the colonists put it, for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's that urge that forced a cultural revolution even. And then they go on to say that these short-term adaptations gain entry into the genome as marks in the epigenome, leading to certain epigenetic changes, which are medium-term modifications. Finally, such epigenetic changes become established due to continuation of cultural selective pressures over thousands of years and become long-term adaptations, resulting in definite genetic mutations. Thus, the underlying mechanism of evolution of species is given a novel explanation, which has been lacking since a long time, since long. So here's this picture they're painting of shifts in consciousness that go into culture, that go into the epigenetics of a species, that end up affecting the genetic evolution of a species. Remarkable ideas. And here's another thought from the paper. And this one has amazing implication for us as human beings and our own rebirth as human beings. They talk about the intensity of the urge. So what they say is this, that genetic composition is not the chief factor, which is responsible for the positive or successful response of the species. Rather, It is an external consciousness generated in the species by its depth of urge in the mind, which physiologically changes the genetic composition in the species to determine its extent of positivity and success to the environmental challenges. Lack of this urge-driven conscious ordering mechanism to survive leads to its eventual collapse to the thermodynamic equilibrium state of maximum disorder of its constituent atoms, and can thus cause its extinction. So they're talking about this creative urge, and there's a lot of scientific language in here, which we're going to let go of now, I think, for the most part, having had our minds challenged a little bit by it all. But I invite us to think about the implications for us, even at this time of global pandemic. So we can feel that urge in ourselves. We don't want to be put down by this external reality. And we want to live, we want to thrive, we want to grow, we want to prosper as a human being, and then as a species. And we can see all that's happening in our world culture that is an expression of that urge to survive. And that urge is, yes, individual, but there's a cultural urge as well. Because certainly for any species to survive, it cannot just be the individuals of that species where the urge is. There has to be a collective urge, an urge to survive and thrive as a species. And so more and more, we're thinking like that as a species. How do we thrive on this planet? How do we move forward and allow the planet itself to move forward with us? At the same time, we don't have to look very far to see a disconnection from the urge, which is this remarkable thing that happens for us as human beings with our right of free choice. We have this remarkable switch that we somehow can turn off, so that even though everything in us is filled with this urge to live, to thrive, to manifest, to be, to become, we can somehow switch it off and become dysfunctional and narcissistic, self-absorbed, self-obsessed. And here in America, us Americans, we lament the fact that we look at our federal government and we ask ourselves, what are you doing? And I'm not here today to pick on my federal government, but just to use an example of how we can switch off the urge and move into some kind of preoccupied, self-obsessed behavior. So we have the opportunity here, right here and now, to tune into the creative urge. What I know about that is it takes a heart connection. As it was said in the article, it's instinctual, and we tune into the instinctual urge through a heart connection, through the emotional body and the human experience. So when that urge finds expression, it moves through us consciously, and we tune into the universal intelligence of the urge. That universal intelligence creates galaxies and suns and solar systems, and created the natural world in which we live, and even created us as a species. So we tune into that universal intelligence. And then those shifts interact with the morphic field in which we live, that has the memory and the habit patterns of human culture. So instead of being bound by that culture, defined by that culture, we're interacting with it. And we're bringing fresh awareness based on the creative urge, the urge to thrive, the urge to prosper. We're bringing that fresh awareness into the morphic field, creating shifts in the morphic field, which end up being shifts in culture around the world. Rupert Sheldrake talks about morphic resonance, meaning that there are all the obvious ways in which consciousness moves into the culture. There are all the forms of media, for instance. So we're connected now by media around the world. That's true. But what he suggests is that morphic resonance doesn't depend on physical proximity or outer form. That these fields, which have been studied scientifically, are resonating at a level that transcends the realms of form that we're aware of. You might say the morphic field itself is a form. So as universal intelligence, fresh consciousness is moving through us into the morphic field in which we live, there's a morphic resonance with the fields all around us. Of course, that resonance is happening anyway, and we're feeling it. We're feeling what's happening for people around the globe. But now we're becoming consciously aware of that resonance, and also we're influencing the resonance because of the conscious awareness we're bringing to it. Our conscious thought doesn't have the ability to simply to change culture directly. So that would be, I think, imagination or fantasy, that just because you think a thought, it changes culture around the world. It's the thought that's changing your own morphic resonance that is resonating into the morphic field of the species. Of course, there's probably layers of that. It's resonating in the immediate morphic field you're a part of, in your community, your family, in your nation, perhaps, whatever cultural group, ethnic group you're a part of, and then moving on out, resonating into the larger morphic field. And the morphic field is responsible to the patterns of thought and awareness, very much the same way that memory is influenced by the conscious awareness that's going into the memory. Memory can influence conscious awareness, but then when we wake up consciously, our thoughts are going into the memory. So it's working both ways. And we're becoming more masters of our experience when we become aware of that relationship. So what I'd like to do now is to share with you simply different terminology from the world of religion that speaks to these very same things, not named according to the terminology of the scientists of today, but named with more, with words that come out of the religious field. So we talk about the creative word. In the book of John and the Gospels, it begins by saying, in the beginning was the Word. So what is that word? That word is the urge of the universe to express itself, to manifest, to become, to fulfill itself in form. The creative word, the Om. So where there's a reconnection in us to what I call our primal spirituality, we feel that great urge. And then we speak of the mind of God. The mind of God. When we say that, we probably tend to anthropomorphize God, think of God as an old man with a beard up in the sky. But nonetheless, this phrase, the mind of God, can help put us in touch with the creative consciousness that's behind all things, that's behind the universe, that's bringing the universal intelligence into the universe, not as a one-time act, but as an unfolding, reimagining, constant reimagining of creation, of the universe. And then there's the auric field. Auric field. That is another way of naming the morphic field at every level. Many of us are aware that there's the human energy field, we call it, naming it by the energy of it, and it is infused with the creative urge. Our own field of energy as human beings is infused with the creative word or the urge. And with that comes this intelligence that moves into our own field of energy. And named this way, this is our aura, our morphic field that is resonating with the unfolding intelligence and the unfolding urge. Mark mentioned that I practice and teach attunement along with others who are attunement practitioners, many of us part of a guild called the Attunement Guild. And I've written this deck of cards and a book that has prayers and meditations that are about this auric field and how it's energized and how it reshapes and reforms. And then we know that that has this amazing impact on our own physical state and our culture and our way of life as an individual and then collectively. So this beautiful logo is portraying our energy field and how the energy is moving through that field at many layers and moving through the endocrine glands. So that's what's being depicted there. And of course, it has a relationship to what's happening through the chakras. Really, both are simply different ways of approaching the same thing, which is the human energy field or our own auras as human beings. I'm going to stop the sharing of the screen and just explore with you what more there is to share about this. I love the word attunement. It gets to what is to me the obvious implication of all this. The science to me is intriguing. I certainly recommend you, if you aren't familiar with it, look up the work of Rupert Sheldrake, just a brilliant man, is still making a brilliant contribution to human awareness, to science, and approaching it, from the standpoint of a biologist. So that's wonderful. And then these two Indian scientists did a marvelous job and really hiked out there in terms of their awareness of how everything is working. But I do like to bring it right back to what are the implications for us as an individual for how we live our lives and how we allow for a new birth to happen in humanity. What I know about that is that it all tends to go by the wayside where there's a fear-dominated way of thinking and being. When the human heart is filled with fear, it doesn't tune in well to the urge within. It becomes often paralyzed by that fear. And so the process of attunement is a conscious process. It's a process, as the word implies, of resonating with the urge that's within, and then allowing that resonance to move through oneself in a heart-connected kind of way. And I'm pretty sure that everyone who's a part of this today has had the experience that when we do that, when there are shifts in consciousness that are with the intent of tuning in to the urge, the creative urge within us, that with that tuning in, something happens in our own awareness. Something happens in the heart that tunes in. There's a peacefulness and a stillness, relaxation, a calm. And then our own loving nature gets activated. And that loving nature is our own creative nature that's been activated by the urge within. And we start thinking differently, letting go of whatever self-preoccupation, self-obsession we have. We just start to think different thoughts that we hadn't thought before. We find out that our mind is not just for our own use to make it through the day or figure out our own lives, but our mind is there as an instrument of universal thought. So if you think of the world that you live in, what happens if you give over your mind to be the mind of that field? For me, where I live at Sunrise Ranch, I give my mind over to be the mind of Sunrise Ranch, to allow Sunrise Ranch to think through me, to think what it needs to think, to be aware of what it needs to be aware of. If I'm self-preoccupied, I'm not available for that. But whatever that field is that you're a part of, your family, your community, your country, do you ever think about giving your mind over to be the mind of that field? And then open yourself up to the creative thoughts that come through, the creative awareness that enters your mind, and you wonder, where did that thought come from? Get tired of thinking the same old thoughts, maybe this is a good exercise. Thoughts of self-preoccupation and worry and anxiety get tiring, truly, and boring. And then when we give ourselves over to be an instrument of the mind of the field in which we live, the mind, and ultimately the mind of the universe. It's just something else that happens. And then we get activated energetically, for sure, when that happens. So we become enthusiastic. So the root of the word enthusiasm is entheos, and it has to do with God within. So the creative word within us is now resonating through our field and through us physically, even through the little culture of one that we are, and then in what we're sharing with other people. And we have a chance to share that enthusiasm together, not because we're somehow trying to gin it up, generate it on some kind of arbitrary basis, but because it just naturally happens. There's that urge within, and when you let that urge within, all that happens. You know, we move from that urge to this flow of intelligence through thought, through flow of awareness, and then our morphic field begins to shift and change. There are new habits being instilled into it, new morphic resonance beginning to happen. In attunement, we take advantage of that morphic resonance, and we offer attunement through the hands. So we offer our own auric resonance to the auric field of another person. It's a beautiful, beautiful process. It can happen in a beautiful way in the same physical space. When someone receives an attunement in that way. But as Rupert Sheldrake said, morphic resonance doesn't rely on physical proximity. That morphic resonance can leap over oceans, if you will. It isn't defined by geography. So I know that together as awake human beings on this Zoom call with the 8 o'clock club, thank you, Mark, for pulling all this together. You know, we're in one morphic field. We're sharing one morphic resonance. We are not only resonating with each other, but opening up to that urge within us, the creative urge within us. Opening up to it more and more deeply, letting it in, becoming aware of it, finding there's a heart resonance with it, and then even a physical resonance. And in our collective field, more and more, there's morphic resonance. And I can only say that we have to appeal to some kind of inner wisdom and find some way of balancing all the factors and all the needs. And somewhere in all that, know that we matter too, you know. So our own thriving as an individual, as an individual human being is so important in it all, because if that's not going on, it all breaks down. So that's the best I can say is I have faith that there's an inner wisdom, and somewhere in that we know. And we just have to get in touch with our knowing and with that wisdom.
Yeah. And I think Zephany finishes things off nicely for us, and I'll read what she says. We would have loved you to be here in Cape Town, David. The gift, however, is stepping consciously into the morphic field, and in doing that, transmuting what needs to be transmuted and attuned, and not fear technology, but reconfigure it with the power of our consciousness in the morphic fields. So some wise words from Zephany. Yeah. David, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your time with us this evening. I know the guys from Gatehouse are very glad that you are here, as are all of our regulars at the 8 o'clock club who we're looking forward to seeing you in Cape Town. We're really grateful for the sharing of your wisdom, and we really look forward to hearing from you again